So the first part of our review is I'd just like to remind you that we had 4 types of hazards to be aware of. They're physical, biological, chemical, and psychological. And that risk is the probability of injury or damage occurring. And just keep those terms straight as we move forward. Remember that any time we use controls to mitigate a hazard, we're going to try to use the hierarchy of controls to establish that level of priority. And we're going to use things like workplace inspections and incident investigations to check that the controls that we've put in place are effective. Okay, so with element C, what our goal is to become aware of when the relevant industry-specific control programs for the manufacturing sector. Also, we want to make sure that we're aware of the regulatory requirements for these specific control programs and understand the typical structure of a control program to meet the requirements. Lastly, in this list, we're going to identify and understand the relevancy to our OC audit requirements so that when you build a program, it will meet the requirements of your OC audit. So, just as a review again, what is an industry-specific control program? It's one that has specific known hazards in the manufacturing industry, and normally they're particularly high risk. In other words, if you have an issue in confined space, it could have a very traumatic consequence. So as a result, it has special regulations. Also, we're going to try to cover some of the industry best practices to ensure that you have a good program when you get started. And if we have all of these items in place, you should have a due diligence defense. Okay? Without the documentation that we're talking about, it will be very difficult to prove your diligence in a court of law. So, review of the specifics from part 1. We covered contractor safety management, mobile equipment, confined space entry, radiation, lockout de-energization, hot work, and fall protection. If you have any questions from the previous 7 that we covered in our last session, I'll get you to type them in the chat window and we'll address them first at the end of this presentation during the question period. Okay? So just make sure that you type those in there if you have any questions on the first 7. For today, we're going to have 2 lessons, basically. The first lesson will cover the structure of the industry-specific control programs and the legislation that applies. Lesson 2 will cover the OC requirements for industry-specific control programs. And again, you saw this in our last webinar. We followed the same process. The industry-specific control programs we're covering today are industrial safety process monitoring, WMIS, hearing conservation, MSI prevention, industrial storage racking, machine safeguarding, and fixed overhead cranes and hoists, and the last one is working alone or in isolation. Okay, let's get to the fun and games. Legislation. Because of the specific requirements around these programs, they have specific requirements under the regulations. For industrial process safety monitoring, they're under Part 6.116-6.132. We'll give you the sections in the Workers' Compensation Act that you need to be aware of. WMIS is Part 5. Hearing conservation is Part 7, Division 1. MSI prevention is Part 4.46 to 4.53. Industrial racking is 4.43 to 4.45. Fixed overhead cranes and hoists are Part 14. Machine safeguarding is Part 12, and working alone or in isolation is Part 4.20 to 4.23. Again, that's for your reference when you're building your program. You also have all sorts of additional resources on the WorkSafe BC website. So if you have any concerns, don't be afraid to check that out. And again, there is the address if you want to search it. So let's get started. The structure of a control program. All of the next sections require some kind of hazard assessment to determine your need for these programs. Understand that after you've actually assessed the risk, you might not require one of these programs. So this is a very important part. However, if an auditor comes to you and asks you why you do not have a hearing conservation program, you're going to have some answer to why you don't. So if you have an assessment that's been conducted or a noise assessment that says it's not required, that's all you need to do. But require some sort of documentation saying that you've assessed your work site and determined that the hazard is not present. So just be aware that some kind of documentation is going to be required for no program to be in place. All of the programs have controls to mitigate the hazard. All of the programs will require training for your employees that handle the hazard. All of the programs will have some kind of supervision requirement to ensure that the program is followed, and a program evaluation to ensure that it stays current. Let's start with a hazard assessment. A hazard assessment is a formal process to identify the hazards. Now, in our last webinar, we actually give you an example of one of our MSABC forms. Understand that some of the programs will require a more exhaustive study. For instance, a confined space assessment will be longer than a page. So depending on the program, remember that it could have different assessments that have been put in place to help you answer all those questions. Again, if you have any questions, don't be afraid to give us a call. These formal processes will assign risks and prioritize the hazards, so you know which ones have to be dealt with. In order to assess the hazards properly, you need to have a comprehensive list of the tasks that you're doing at your workplace. You need to have a formal review process to make sure that your controls that you put in place are actually effective. And of course, if you're going to have a process, you need to have training for the involved people. Back up one question here. Remember that if you're going to train your employees on any of these subjects, you need to make sure you retain the documentation in a file. One of the problems that we have with many of our people that we work with is they've done the training but they've lost the documentation. So make sure that you put it in a secure place or scan it so that you can actually have it in an electronic form in case you're looking for it later on. Again, this is a hazard assessment form. There's multiple different varieties of these. This is one that we use quite frequently. Understand that there is ones that are customized for things like confined space or machine guarding that will help you answer more specific questions. But again, they follow the same concept. Okay, control mechanisms. These are practices, procedures, and standards to control the hazards that you've identified. And again, just as a review, you see the hierarchy of controls on your right-hand side of the screen there. We obviously want to start with elimination, move to substitution, engineering controls, administrative controls, and PPE is the order of controls that we like to follow. I'd like to bring to your attention that the blue is most effective at the top of the graphic and the red is the least effective. Also, I'd like you to notice that as you move down the graphic, more and more supervision is required in order to keep those controls active and effective. So obviously, if you want to have less supervision, you'd like to use the top of the control pyramid there, or in this case, the blue level of elimination. What these do is these control the hazards that you're in your work, and it's a systematic approach. You want to identify the critical tasks and use job observations to ensure that your processes are working effectively. Unfortunately, whenever you're dealing with people, you're going to have a enforcement protocol for when someone doesn't follow the regulations or your job procedures. and reporting and analysis to ensure that your procedures are being followed and that they're documented properly, meeting the regulations. One of the important parts of this that a lot of people lose is the preventative maintenance of some of these controls. So whether it's safeguarding or toxic process gases, all of these safety systems that are put in place to control the hazard require some kind of maintenance to ensure they work effectively. So don't forget that as part of your program. Supervision. For your supervisors on the floor, understand that they need to document when they have an issue with a particular employee or a particular process. One of the best ways of doing this is a job task observation. Also, we need to keep track of any corrective measures that we change or retraining of employees that takes place. Again, we need to have a disciplinary protocol so that everyone understands how the system works. Program evaluation. We need to clearly set out the goals and standards, and we need to keep it current. And this is something I'd really like to bring to your attention as a small employer, because most of you will be experiencing very rapid growth in your future. As a result, it's quite often that you have equipment changes and material changes in your process. This is one of the reasons why we need to have these programs re-evaluated as you change equipment and change processes that you are using. Some of the hazards will change as well. So you really want to make sure that you have a regular, routine program evaluation to ensure that anything that's changed is taken into account. A formal review process also involves the workers from the Occupational Health and Safety Committee, and the goal there is they actually understand the upset conditions that they have to deal with to make sure that all your hazards are covered in your process. Normally, we like to set a frequency for that review, and a good place to start is annually. However, if you buy new equipment, it's not a bad time to do an additional review to make sure that the hazards have been taken care of. If you change your process, you need to make sure that those changes are clearly communicated, not only to your production crews, but also to the maintenance crews to ensure that they're aware of any changes that have taken place. So, summarizing what we've covered so far, the industry-specific control programs all share the same type of structure. All of them have specific legislation as far as the requirements by the employer. So, for a polling question, is everyone comfortable with building an industry-specific program today? Now let's give you a minute to respond to that. Okay, so very good. So most of you are comfortable with that. Again, I'd like to remind you, if you're having any issues with these programs, it's not a problem for you to send a quick email, and me or will try to step you through those problems that you have. Okay, so now we can move on to lesson 2, the fun part. These are the OC requirements for these specific control programs. Again, as a review, we've covered this before, but just for new people or people that have forgotten over the holidays, the criteria for these industry-specific control programs is there's 15 control programs in total. You need to have a 50% overall to pass this element. It counts for 10% of your overall score, and you need 80% to overall to pass the OC audit. Now, again, I'd like to remind you that any NA categories are not included in the total. So, for instance, if you don't have toxic process gases, it's just removed from the audit, so it doesn't affect any of those scores. So, on with the show. Industrial process safety monitoring is the first program we're going to discuss today. And again, it needs a hazard assessment to identify areas for installation of fixed gas monitors. I'm not sure if all of you are familiar with what is considered to be a toxic process gas. But what it is a gas that's actually toxic to the human body. The common ones that we deal with in the manufacturing industry are things like ammonia that is used in refrigeration systems, or ozone, for instance, that is used for purification or disinfection in a lot of our food processing facilities. Most of these toxic gases are harmful to the human body, so as a result we need to have safety systems involved, so if there is a leak in your equipment, that the alarm is sounded so people are not harmed. And this is what this is about. So we need to have clearly defined responsibilities for system maintenance to ensure that that system stays in good operating condition. We need to have specific emergency response procedures, so if there is a leak or damage occurs, that everyone knows what the protocol is. Regular calibration schedules to ensure that the safety process monitoring is being on track. Fixed gas monitoring maintenance records to actually demonstrate that the machines are working as per design. Appropriate training for the at-risk workers, maintenance personnel, and contractors that are working with those systems. And what to do if there's an alarm present and when levels are uncertain as far as your employees. Whoops, a little too fast there. You're also going to need a regular check to determine compliance with the above and with documented audit results. So again, it's not good enough to have systems in place. We have to confirm that they're actually functioning properly. Next on my list is WMIS. And WMIS is one of the common ones that I'm sure that all of you have some portion of. Again, a hazard assessment to identify the chemicals that you have on site and their risks. An inventory of the chemicals, their uses, storage locations, and the quantities. Generic worker training and workplace-specific training for at-risk workers. Before I get too much further, I'd like to bring up one key element here. This is looking like a lot of work already for small employers. I'd like to bring to your attention that you have control of this element. You control how many chemicals you have on site, and as a result, you can specify which chemicals you want to have and which ones you don't want to have. If you have 12 degreasers on site, this is greatly going to amplify the work that you have to do. There's no reason that 1 or 2 would not be sufficient. So there's many companies that have many chemicals on site that they have never actually used, or they've used once or twice and have just got stored on the shelf. If you are setting up your own small business, keep this in mind, that any chemical that you have on site you're going to have to be reporting on. So as a result, keep the number of chemicals to a minimum and you will reduce the workload that you have. Proper labeling is required anytime you move one chemical from its original container into a secondary container. So again, unless you absolutely have to, try to minimize the transfer of containers from their original container if you can. Now this is unavoidable with some chemicals such as hydraulic oil, where you get it in a 55-gallon drum and you have to go fill up a 1-gallon reservoir. But for a lot of chemicals such as Windex, there's no reason that you have to transfer it out of one container into another. Remember that your material safety data sheets need to be current, and that's not older than 3 years. This is going to be a little bit ticklish coming up in the next little while with the introduction of WMIS 2015, because some people will be receiving SDS sheets. So again, be aware of what you have in your book. Any serious chemical that you have on your site should require that you have an emergency cleanup response procedure so that people are not hurt by cleaning up the chemical. Eye wash stations and chemical showers are required as specified in the MSDS. Again, this is something that you have control of. Be aware that if you have a very toxic or high molarity acid, that the eye wash station requirements can be severe. Not only do you require an eye wash station, you might be required to install a heating device to keep the water warm during a flushing cycle that could last up to 45 minutes long. So again, you are in control of the chemicals that you're bringing on site. Make sure that you are not specifying chemicals that are going to require additional control measures. So be aware of the chemicals you're bringing on site. You can specify to bring in chemicals that are a lot less harmful and bringing them in a little more frequently to avoid some of these regulations. Next up is hearing conservation. In order to have a hearing conservation program, you need to have a completed noise survey. Training on hazards of exposure to noise and the proper use and maintenance of hearing protection. And requirements for wearing hearing protection in noise zones. Before I go much further with this, I'd like to bring to your attention that if you take the time to have a completed noise survey completed, you might find that you do not require a hearing conservation program. If your noise levels are below the 82 decibel action level, no hearing protection program is required. But understand that you're going to have a completed noise survey in order not to have a program. So again, if you follow that assessment, it could determine that you no longer have to have a program. However, if you do have a program as a result of a noise survey, you will have to complete audiometric screening within the first 6 months of employment of your employees, and an annual one further for the time that you have them employed. You'll have to send those tests to WorkSafe BC as part of that requirement. Reference letters for workers who have suspected hearing loss to see their physicians if you find that some of your employees have had experienced hearing loss as a result of your time at work. One of the concerns around this is whether the hearing loss took place at your work site or from previous employment. One of the ways to answer this question is to test your employees before they are hired to determine their hearing level before they set foot on your site. And that will help with that requirement. MSI prevention. Again, an MSI-specific hazard ID process to identify the risks at your site, following a proper risk evaluation process. You complete the risk assessment for jobs identified presenting ergonomic risks, implement the control measures using the hierarchy of controls, develop safe work procedures based on the assessment, and conduct appropriate training for the at-risk workers. Anytime you do training, you want to make sure you have training records for the employees. Again, there is a requirement to evaluate the program annually or whenever there are significant changes to the workflow or processes. Again, the only thing constant in business is change. So you want to make sure that when you buy new equipment that you have evaluated the risks involved for MSIs in this case. Industrial storage racking. This is something that a lot of us haven't spent much time on because we just assume that if you buy racks that they should be okay. Unfortunately, that's not the case, and as a result, there's been many injuries in the last little while around storage racking systems. As a result, WorkSafe is actually formulating new rules as we speak. So the reason I'm bringing this to your attention as new employer or as small business owners is that if you go to the auction and buy racking, you want to make sure that you are buying racking that has engineering standards on it and load ratings, because otherwise you would be faced with the bill of hiring a professional engineer to develop those load ratings for you after you've installed it in order to meet requirements. So industrial storage racking systems for manufacturers or professional engineers, pardon me, let's try that one more time. You need to install industrial racking systems to manufacturer's specifications or have a professional engineer give you the instructions. The organization has performed a needs assessment that includes the products to be stored, the material handling equipment that's going to be placing the equipment on the racks, and the facility characteristics. Facility characteristics could be what type of floor is the racking being placed on. If you put racking that's designed to hold 10,000 pounds on a wooden floor, you could find the whole thing falling through the floor. So again, be aware of the facility characteristics. Will they support the loads that the racking can support? Safe work procedures for storing, retrieving materials from the racking systems, and a process to ensure that damage to the storage racking system is reported, documented, and corrective action taken. Now, normally this is included in your mobile equipment procedures so that any forklift operator that damages the racking actually has to report it. Secondly, you want to have your workplace inspections include checking the racking to see if there's obvious damage since the last inspection. Machine safeguarding. Machine safeguarding has come a long ways in the last 50 years in the province, but unfortunately we still are hurting a lot of people with machines that aren't properly guarded. In order to have an auditable program, we need to have an assessment to identify the required safeguards for the equipment that you have. The development of the machine inventory that includes the safeguards, written instructions for the use and placement of safeguards, an inspection to ensure safeguards are in place and maintained, including an annual audit for guards with interlocks. For those that are not familiar with interlocked guarding, these are things that have wired switches on gates, for instance, that when you open the gate, the equipment shuts down. And that's what we're referring to by an interlock guard. And these need to be checked a minimum of annually to ensure that they're still being effective. We need to have a written process to report missing safeguards, and this could be as simple as a hazard reporting procedure or form. If you have your own workers building guards, we need to have someone trained as a competent worker in safeguarding to complete the guarding assessments. On to fixed overhead cranes and hoists. If you have overhead cranes and hoists, you need to have an inventory. You need to have safe work procedures for the cranes and hoists and the rigging that you normally use. The operators of cranes and hoists need some training, and it needs to be documented. The cranes, hoists, and rigging need a regular inspection as it requires by the regulations. Any service of the cranes or hoist is done by a certified or qualified person. Oops. Another thing I'd like to mention to you is that any lifting device or any crane that you have needs to be properly marked with a safe working load. So if you have a 1-ton gantry, it should be marked 1-ton safe working load on the beam so everyone can know what it is, and there should be no mismatch of components. In other words, you should not have a 2-ton hoist on a 1-ton crane. So just be aware of those simple things that a lot of people get into trouble with. Any lifting device that you have should also be rated and clearly marked on its lifting capacity. Working alone or in isolation. Again, we need to complete an assessment to identify any working alone or in isolation situations. And the first answer is most people say, oh, everyone works together Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. So we don't have any working alone. The problem is that most accountants or managers end up coming back to the office on Saturday to complete a report or go off to inspect equipment or a job site. So you want to identify those situations where someone is alone and develop a simple reporting in procedure so that everyone knows when someone does not arrive as they're supposed to. Complete a general or specific hazard assessment for employees working alone. Written safe work procedures that include roles and responsibilities for checking on the well-being of employees, frequency of checks, and mandatory end of shifts checks. Now this sounds like a lot of work, but in actual fact there's many different apps out there for your phone or your computer system that are free that help you accomplish all of these. Excuse me. So it doesn't have to be a lot of work to do this, and it provides you with a lot of security as far as knowing where your employees are. So, summary. These are the requirements of your industry-specific control programs. Does everyone know where to find this information? Okay, very good. All of you have looked in your binder and seen it at the back of each section. Okay, our summary for today for Lesson 1 is we covered the structure of the programs and the legislation. In Lesson 2, we reviewed the requirements for the industry-specific control programs. I'm sure you have a few questions, as there's a lot of material that we've just covered in this short break. So I'll get William to write out the questions from the first section from the previous webinar to me first, and we'll cover those off the bat right away.
Okay, for part 1 review, we have, do mobile equipment logbooks need to be filled out every day?
Okay, this is a good question because a lot of the smaller employers have forklifts and mobile equipment on site, but they do not use it every day. And the answer to this question is no, they do not need to be filled out every day if the work is not being done every day. So if you only need the forklift once a week to unload trucks, the regulation states that the pre-use inspection must be done prior to the work on that shift, so the worker or the operator is confident the equipment is safe to operate. So in this case, the pre-use inspection would only have to be done on the day that the equipment is operating.
Another one that I have from review from last time. If I do welding as part of my normal business process, do I require a hot work program for welding?
This is actually another interesting question because most people are concerned about the work that they are doing. In actual fact, the hot work program is designed for people that are on your site that might not be part of your normal routine. And I'll just give you an example of a plumber coming in to do work on your copper lines, and he's sweating the joints. Someone needs to actually check to make sure that he does not leave a fire after he is gone, and that's part of a hot work program. So if you are a welding company, you can have hot work zones where welding takes place, but anything outside that zone requires some kind of attention to make sure that fire is not left after everyone goes home. Does that answer the question, you think, Will?
Yes, sir. The last one that I have for review from last week or last session right now is, do I need to hire an engineer to install a fall protection horizontal lifeline?
Okay, I'm not sure if everyone on our site here today understands what a horizontal lifeline is, but it's basically something similar to a dog run that allows people to be attached while working on things like roofs or vertical structures such as rail cars. The key part here is you can purchase a pre-engineered system and install it as per the instructions and still have an engineered system in place. So you do not need to hire an engineer for a system. You can buy a pre-engineered system and install it as per instructions.
Another follow-up question to that. For fall protection, working at heights is to be considered when working at 25 feet. This is what we spoke about last week. But I believe that it's actually above 10 feet. Can you please clarify for me?
Okay, so the regulation in BC says that you must wear fall protection when working in 2 situations. 1, when you are above 10 feet, or 2, when another hazard exists. Another hazard exists could be working over a live conveyor, where if you fell into that, that would cause irreparable harm. The 25-foot rule is when is a fall protection work plan required. So anytime you're working above 25 feet, a fall protection work plan must be completed. The fall protection work plan specifies how you're going to rescue someone if there is an incident at height at 25 feet. And the next question that usually follows is, well, why 25 feet? And the reason that 25 feet is a problem is because most areas up to 25 feet you can access and effect rescue by single use of a ladder. Above 25 feet, that makes it very difficult to rescue people without having additional equipment. And that's why the requirement is 25 feet for a safe work plan for fall protection. Does that cover your question, Will?
Yes, sir. So that's it for the review from last week, but I do have some questions already from this week as well. So when does my company need to be transitioned fully into WMIS 2015?
Okay, this is actually a good question because we're all faced with the same answer. Technically, all companies need to be updated by November of 2018. Unfortunately, however, if you are receiving products right now that have an SDS instead of an MSDS, you're going to have to train your employees now on WMIS 2015 so they can recognize the hazards on the new SDS sheets. So that means you're going to have to start now.
Excellent. Another one around hearing conservation. If the sound level of my workplace is below 82 decibels overall, do I need to have a hearing conservation program?
Okay, so very good question, because 82 decibels or 82 dBA is the action line for when a safety program needs to be put into place for hearing conservation. If you've done a noise study and found that you are not above 82, you do not require a program. However, that noise study needs to be over an 8-hour period to confirm that there is no peak levels that exceed 140 dBA that require specific protection for that point source exposure. So the short answer is once you're normally below 82, you're good, but by having a proper noise assessment done, it'll also confirm that you have no over peak levels. The other good thing I'd like to mention about the noise assessment is if you do require a hearing protection program, that you will actually only be purchasing hearing protection to give you the minimum coverage that you need. One of the common mistakes that companies make is buying the most effective hearing protection for their employees, which in actually effects handicaps them because they do not have the noise or they cannot hear something like a forklift approaching because they have so much hearing protection. So again, that adds an additional hazard if you do that. If you follow the proper noise assessment, you're only going to buy hearing protection to cover the noise that you're exposed to.
Excellent. I also have a question around ozone. The ozone that is created from the welding process, is this considered a toxic process gas?
Okay, that's a very good question because most people don't realize that ozone is created. The answer to this is that the ozone created from welding is not of a sufficient volume to be considered as a toxic process gas. However, if you have ozone as part of your process for disinfection or for purification, that ozone is a toxic process gas. And it's very harmful for people in volumes. So from welding, no, but if you have ozone from any other source in your process, you will have to have a toxic process gas program.
Excellent. One last one for toxic process gas. I've heard that ammonia requires a separate evacuation procedure. Is that true?
Yes, it is true. The concern around ammonia is depending on which way the wind blows, where should the marshalling point be located? In order to rectify this, the process is to have 2 marshalling points and a windsock. And what amounts to is the employees can check the wind direction before they attend the specific marshalling point to protect them from any fumes that are emanating from the building. So again, you obviously would like to be on the upwind side of any toxic gas leak.
I have one for working alone. Would you be able to recommend one of the apps that you're talking about for working alone?
Yes, actually, we can actually probably send you an email. The one that we use for our company is Slack, is a free app that works on our iPhones, but there's actually several different apps that are available. One of them uses geofencing to tell where your employees are relative to their phone. But our Slack app, basically all it does is it allows our employees to type in where they are going to, and when they arrive, announce that they are there. And as a result, we can track where all our employees are with their full knowledge.
Excellent. I have another one around permitting. Some of the program require permit system to be implemented. Is it possible to use a single permit to cover multiple programs, such as hot work, working at heights, and confined space?
The short answer is no. And the reason for that is because the hazards that are identified for all three of those programs are quite different. You might be able to combine one permit for accessing things at heights and for security, for instance, but you'll not be able to do it for confined space because it is too complex. So again, the key of these programs is to have specific programs and permits that cover the application and the regulations that are required. If you try to mix it all together, chances are you're going to miss out some of those requirements. So my answer would be no, do not use one permit for all three of those.
Excellent. That appears to be the last question that we have for today. I'll give approximately another minute or two to see if anybody has anything else that they'd like to know. But other than that, I'd like to thank Lauren for his time today and thank all of you for attending our fourth session in the webinar series. We'd also like to say that the next webinar will be held on February 1st, and it will be on workplace inspections. I look forward to speaking to you soon.